Oh, great. Thank you to the organisers of this workshop. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here. I have to say, all this talk about melatonin and pineal glands is a bit pointed for me because I think I got about an hour and a half sleep last night coming from the Southern Hemisphere. So please forgive any weird lapses during the talk. I think I'll get it right, but we'll see. Right, so this talk is some follow-up work building on a paper that I published a few years ago. And it's also a sort of call to arms. I'm hoping that other people are moved to follow this branch of the functions research program. I'm going to try to convince you that you ought to. Maybe, can we move that, or is that in the picture? It doesn't matter so much. So in a paper called Does Proper Function Come in Degrees, I described a series of points that, at least as far as I'm concerned, jointly generate a pretty tricky dilemma. So I'm just going to run through that pretty quickly, hopefully. So the first point is just that one of the standard accounts of function and the favorite account of proper function generally is the selected effects, which relies on the action of natural selection to define functions. So here's a quick précis of that from Justine Kingsbury in a paper that's just come out. On this account, the proper function of a trait is what ancestral instances of the trait have done to contribute to the enhanced survival and reproduction of the ancestors of the current trait holder. And here's a quote from Justin Garson from some earlier work. Slightly broader way of putting it, the selected effects theory of function holds roughly that the function of a trait is whatever it was selected for by natural selection or some natural process of selection. I'm pacing backwards and forwards past the mic. Can everyone hear me? Not at home. Right, okay, I'm going to try and stay in this region. Yeah. Right. All right, so I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this, but just to make sure that we're on the same page, here's an example. Hemoglobin molecules do all number of things in the body. They occupy space in red blood cells. They make those cells red because of the iron in the molecule, and they transport oxygen around the body. But only one of these effects is considered to be the proper function of hemoglobin. Why is that? Well, because hemoglobin molecules have been selected on the basis of them transporting oxygen around the body, but not because they make blood red. So why might we think that selected effect function is important? Well, just again, very quickly, and many of you will be familiar with this, here are some of the reasons why we like selected effect function, some of us. So one thing is that selected effects are determined purely by biology. These are objective facts. There is a fact of the matter that hemoglobin was selected in the past. Regardless of whether or not we know about these effects, these are biological facts that we can refer to establish them. Another thing that's nice about selected effects function is that the function of the trait gets to explain the presence of that trait, perhaps in the proportion of the population that we see it. So why do we have hemoglobin in our blood? Because it functions to transport oxygen around our body. And another way to think about this is that it gets the counterfactuals correct. So if it were the case that hemoglobin didn't transport oxygen around the body, we wouldn't have hemoglobin in our blood, or something quite different. But if it were the case that hemoglobin didn't make blood red, this wouldn't affect whether or not we have hemoglobin in our blood whatsoever, because it's just an accident. What's happening with the mouse? And then finally, of course, very pertinent for this workshop, we can use selected effect function to underwrite notions of success and failure. And really importantly, because of that objectivity of the facts underlying it, we can do this naturalistically. So we can talk about ways the body ought to be, what it means for some structure to be in a pathological state, and also we can talk about, in the setting of teleosemantics, why a signal has the content that it does, and what it means for that signal to misrepresent. And again, importantly, this can be done in natural terms. Okay, so that's the first point. This is a popular view, and I think for a good reason. Second point, given that selected effect function is based on biological facts, and so much of the status of that view is based on the fact that it uses biological facts, it had better be the case that the account is sensitive to the biological facts. And here's one fact that I think is potentially problematic. Natural selection comes in degrees. So, for example, I'm going to have to go through these pretty quickly, but you probably see that selection coefficient of different traits varies. The strength of selection operating on, for example, a heart valve is very strong. If we have a mutation that's going to change the shape of that heart valve, it's going to be selected against pretty strongly. But there are other traits that are under selection, but not as strongly. Our fingernails and toenails need to be the right amount of strength to protect our digits from certain kinds of trauma. And so that's under selection, but if something happened to the strength of your fingernails or toenails, you'd probably be all right. Your fitness expectations might be slightly lowered, but only slightly. Even more briefly, selection pressure changes over time. So something that was under quite strong selection in the past might not be under very strong selection now, or the direction of selection might even be reversed. So we have a waxing and waning of selection for different traits. And also the substrate that selection's acting on might vary too. So for example, you might have a population of individuals very densely packed, interacting with one another at the carrying capacity of their resources. Nature's going to be very red in tooth and claw. In that case, selection will be operating very strongly, but you can also have populations that are quite sparse, quite limited in numbers, quite drifty, and you might have natural selection acting in that case, but it won't be nearly as strong. This is a point that Justin's discussed in some of his earlier work, and actually some current work. Third point, we treat functions at least as being binary though. Okay? We don't, when I was talking about hemoglobin, I didn't say it's quite a lot of a function of hemoglobin to transport oxygen. I just said it is the function of hemoglobin to transport oxygen, and it is not the function to make blood red. So it's very much the case that we think of these in binary ways. Now, if we put all this together, it seems that the proponents of selected effects functions owe us something. Okay? There needs to be something said about how we have this graded input and appear to have a binary output at the other end. And by the way, this binary nature of the functions really does seem to be quite important to discharging some of the tasks that we put this notion to in our philosophical views. Okay, so proponents of selected effects function have to say something to accommodate this tension. And it seems to me, at least, there's two ways that they might do this. They're going to have to either give us an account of how we have a graded input and result in a binary output, or they discard the idea of this binary output and allow that functions can come in degrees. Okay, both of these, this is why it's a dilemma, both options have lots of problems. So here's one problem. If we choose to have binary functions, then naturally we might think of it being some kind of threshold account. Once you get enough strength of selection over a long enough period of time, now we have a function. But until then, there just was no function. But of course, the question is, where on earth would we draw this line? And it seems that we're not going to get this from biology or any kind of well-motivated cutoff point. So firstly, we can't make the line interest dependent if we're going to want to say that our account of function is an objective account of function. It's not going to be a way of keeping values or interests out of our theories. We can't say any amount of selection whatsoever is for something as a function, because then we're going to be absolutely flooded in functions. So think of something that has almost no selection or famously doesn't have any selection, like the redness of blood caused by hemoglobin. Well, if any selection's enough counted as being a function, maybe there was that time a few hundreds of years ago in my ancestral lineage where my ancestors were dueling and didn't notice they'd been stabbed, but someone else noticed the redness on their shirt, and so they got to the surgeon in time and it saved their life. So even if this was a very circumscribed period of time, only happened very occasionally, that's some selection, and now suddenly it's a function of hemoglobin to make blood red. It can't be the most selected effect because many genuine functions aren't going to make the grade. Suddenly it would seem that fingernails and toenails don't have a function at all. On the other hand, if we choose graded functions, there are a lot of costs to pay there. It's a very counterintuitive kind of a view, revisionary and counterintuitive. Again, what would it mean to say that something's got a little bit of a function, or that some bodily structure a little bit ought to behave in some way? It's very hard to understand what this means. Again, we have a repeat of the any selection problem because it's not as bad as the threshold view, but we're suddenly going to be flooded with all sorts of partial functions all over the place. It's a little bit of a function, perhaps, that hemoglobin makes blood red. And finally, it's very hard for me to understand, I'm going to talk about this in a second, what this would mean for teleosemantics to start talking about there being partial functions, if we think that's how we determine content. Okay, I've taken too long for this bit, so I'm going to be really fast. So in the paper, I thought I was being quite neutral. I was just presenting a dilemma. What actually happened is that everyone thought I was arguing for partial functions. Looking back, with good reason, I thought I was being neutral. I wasn't being that neutral. But there was a good reason to be neutral. And that was because I was really unsure about the view. So here are some problems. I'm not going to get through all of them, I don't think, with the time. First, I wasn't at all clear actually what the gains would be. I mean, it helps us deal with this problem of there being gradual degrees of natural selection, but beyond that, I'm not sure what good having a partial view of functions would do. I was worried about whether or not I'd really given the threshold view a good enough showing. I went very quickly there, but I didn't spend much more time on it in the article. This idea of partial content, if we were going to deploy it in teleosemantics, seemed extremely problematic. And I just really balked at the idea that the biological world is completely saturated in partial functions all over the place for lots of different reasons, not the least of which it makes definitions of pathology quite tricky. Okay, so that's the summary. It's taken me just over 10 minutes. I'm going to have to be much faster. Now, some things have happened in my thinking, and there's been some work in print on this since I published the paper, and I just want to talk a bit about that because I've started to change my mind. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about an article that comes from Paul Griffiths' lab at the University of Sydney, the Theory and Method in Biosciences group. So this is an article that's a target article in a special issue that I'm curating, that there are people in the audience today who are contributing to this. So here's the main thrust of the article in question though. So Joshua Christie et al., they claim that actually in many selective scenarios, real life selective scenarios that we see in the biological world, it turns out that selected effect functions do not explain the presence of their traits. And of course, as I pointed out at the start, that's one of the most important motivations for the view in the first place. So it's quite a problem. Now, in classic examples, the kind of example that I gave you with hemoglobin, the selective scenario is fixed. It's very clear where the fitnesses lie. And so we can make a real sense of the idea that there has been selection for that particular trait effect. But of course, these are often made up scenarios, not always. And in the real world, actually the environment varies a lot of the time, and fitness will change a lot of the time. And furthermore, these cases can be more complicated than mere variation. For example, you might get feedback effects, like we might see in frequency dependent selection. So they give an example of this, where they talk about a case where we have finches, and there are two phenotypes. There's a red type that's the aggressive type, or the hawk type, and black-headed finches that are the passive type, or the dove type. And what happens is red-headed finches are able to displace the black-headed finches from territory, nesting sites, I think. But when they encounter another red-headed finch, they have a fight, and this can be quite dangerous for both finches. Right? So depending on who you meet as a red-headed finch, it can be a good or a bad outcome given your phenotype. Now, according to Christie et al., displacing black-headed finches has a fitness payoff, so that looks like it's going to be a selective effect. The question is, does that explain why we see red-headed finches in the population to the extent that we do? And they say, no, this is not the explanation, or even an explanation, or an adequate explanation for the presence of the red-headed phenotype. Because if you were to talk to a biologist about why we see the red-headed phenotype in the proportions that we do, they're going to talk about the initial proportions of the two different phenotypes at the start. and how often they meet each other, and how quickly the population evolves over time, what the costs are of meeting another red-headed finch, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, it turns out that the fact that you're displacing black-headed finches washes out of the story quite a bit. So selection plays some role, of course, but it plays a minor role, and they think it's actually so minor that you would be misleading if you were to say that this was the explanation. So here's a quote: in most cases, if a trait has a selected effect function, then that function conveys some explanatorily relevant information about the evolution of the trait. But in the cases we have described, that information is merely a fragment and very far from an explanation of the trait. Now, just to be clear, they're not saying that this isn't the entire explanation. They're not saying that it has to be all selection. They're saying that this doesn't even constitute an adequate part of the explanation. Or another way that they put it is that by saying that the reason that we see the red-headed finches is because they displace black-headed finches is actually to misrepresent the scenario as though it's one of those simple ones. Now, as I say, there's a special issue on this, and so I've seen lots of replies, okay, and there are various ways that people have responded to this, but one way that we might reply is to say, look, you're asking too much. It doesn't matter how much of an influence selection has had on the outcome, it's just that it had some influence on the outcome that's enough. And this raises questions of how minimal the influence can be to have an adequate explanation of some phenotypic outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And this is important, of course, and interesting. But I want to say, maybe we don't need to have this fight if we adopt a graded view. I think we can diffuse this issue to a reasonable extent. Because these two problems that we're talking about coincide, I think, and a graded functions view will mitigate this debate that we might have about whether or not some trait explains, whether some effect explains the presence of a trait. Because fine, it might be that in some of these cases, the proper function fails to explain the presence of the trait to core. But the partial proper function is allowed to explain the presence of the trait to a partial extent that we might actually be able to specify. And then there's no reason for us to have this kind of debate. So in this way, by just embracing a partial kind of a view and not being forced to adjudicate about a binary the matter in a binary way, we can still hold on to the credentials of the selective effects functions by allowing that they have some explanatory role to play, but we're not forced into having to overstate their power. Okay, so that's the first case. Second case, Justine Kingsbury has published a paper recently called New Challenges to the Selected Effects Theory of Biological Function. I think it's in Synthes. Of retaining these binary functions. So remember that the issue here is, where do we draw this threshold? And her place to draw the threshold is to say any positive selection whatsoever is going to qualify to make some effect a function. Now, she freely acknowledges my worry that this is going to generate an absolute flood of functions in the world. But she embraces it. She bites the bullet and says, great, we've discovered something really interesting about selected functions. They're everywhere. But in order to sort of marshal this, she introduces another caveat that says, nevertheless, most of these functions are going to be uninteresting to us or unimportant or extremely negligible. And I read Justin's response to this problem in a reasonably similar way, but we'll find out perhaps. And this is reflected in how strong selection is acting. So most of the functions that are there because of some tiny bit of selection will probably fall into the category of the uninteresting kinds of functions, goes the thought. Just to be clear, this is an objectivist account of where functions are. It's not saying that whether something gets to count as a proper function depends on our interest. It's just saying whether or not we should notice or care about this function. So it's still an objective account. I'm convinced that by her that I did discard this option too quickly. I was too fast to think that this wasn't going to work. And I do think that this is the best shot for a threshold view, although, and also I think there's another way that we might strengthen it, although I'm going to run out of time, I'm almost certain, so I won't get to that. Okay, I do have my concerns though. So first, notice how incredibly revisionary this is. Once again, this is going to say something like, yes, it is the case that it is the function of hemoglobin to make blood red, but just negligibly. which might not affect too much in our sort of day-to-day, but it does seem like a very strong divergence from how we normally think about functions. I mean, that's one of the classic cases of something not being a function. We would have to discard that. But more importantly, I think it's not really doing the job that we need it to, because remember, again, going back to the start of the talk, one of the primary benefits of the selected effects account was that we could say that this was purely determined on objective grounds. We have an objective criterion that we can roll out when we're trying to give a definition of disease. Our account of content can be entirely naturalized and not depend on more sophisticated kinds of interests or values. But I think that Kingsbury's approach ends up rendering these criteria evaluative. Whether or not we care about the function is now going to be the thing that says that we're going to plug it into our account of pathology, or whether we think that the amount of selection, amount of function is considered negligible is going to determine whether or not we think it bears content or not. Or another way to put it is that much of the philosophical work based on proper functions requires functionhood to be a purely biological fact, and there aren't any facts in biology about which functions are negligible or uninteresting. So I don't think it works. Okay. I've got 9 minutes. Let's go. Third step. So that's the second step. Third step. As I said a couple of times, one of my biggest worries in that original paper was what this would mean for teleosemantics. I really couldn't get my head around what it would mean. So here I say, what would it mean for some state to exhibit a partial degree? What it would mean for some state to exhibit a partial degree of representational content isn't clear. To me, at least, I can't really get my head around that. However, there was a paper that was already out at the time that I wish I'd noticed, I connected with this, that came from Nick Shea and Peter Godfrey-Smith and Rosa Cow that came out in 2018 called Content in Simple Signaling Systems, that I think at least points to a way that we might get our head around this. This is going to be really challenging, jet-lagged. Okay. So here, Shea et al., they outline a formal notion of what we're going to call functional content, and that's distinct from informational content. Where functional content is content that reflects the contribution of some world state towards stabilizing some signaling system. Okay, so we have a signaling system, and we relate the content of that signaling system to the world state. Yeah, there was a success of that signaling system, essentially, which is basically a teleosemantic type account where the success world state is going to determine the content of that signal. So here's the setup. It's going to be quite abstract, but hopefully it'll work okay. So they simplify the scenario. So we just talk about world states, signals from a signaler, and acts from a consumer of the signal. All right. So we have two world states, let's say, predator in the air, predator in the ground. I really hope I'm not putting this too much, Nick. We have two signals, maybe a screech and a hoot from some small mammal, and some acts, hide or from the offspring of that ground predator. Now, in the most simple case, the best outcome for the sender and the receiver is going to be that Act 1 is performed in world state 1 and Act 2 is performed in, world state 1 and Act 2 in state 2. Now, there are two ways that this can play out in equilibrium because the signals are arbitrary. I'm so sorry that this has been cut off. So here we basically have, when there's an air predator, you screech and everyone hides. And when there's a ground predator, you hoot and everyone climbs. Okay. Now, when we want to say what's the meaning of those messages, what's the meaning of screech? The meaning is air predator, because that's the world state that gives us fitness advantage when we use this signal. And of our M2, it's ground predator. And we can see, and here that it's how we might understand this. Well, but now they go on to consider a case of partial calling. So now we've got three messages, three world states, and three acts. Let's say this is no predators and this is continued foraging. Okay. But now we have that there are two messages that correspond to this. So you can either hoot or make a tutting noise or something like that when there's no predators around and everyone keeps speaking. But now when either kind of predator is around, we're going to get this whatever the other one was, scratch. Okay, and then there's going to be some distribution of X over that. Well, what do we say about the content of these signals? Well, firstly, these two signals, N2 and N3, are going to have the content of everything's fine. That's fine. But what about N1? Because there are now two world states and acts that are going to contribute to success in this situation. Well, we still want to tie the content of N1 to the states that have led to the payoff, but we need to mix them both. And so what happens in the article is that Shea et al. Follow skirms, and they say that we can think of this as being a content vector, okay, where there are going to be two contributions to the content of the signal coming from both S1 and S2. So the dimension values are determined then by the role that each of these world states plays in maintaining the signaling system, okay. And here's a quote: the result is a vector representing the relative importance of each state to the stabilization of the sender and receiver rules for that message. This can be seen as a measure of the degree of involvement of the message with each state. And that involvement is going to be determined by the frequency and the payoff of the world states and the behaviors that are taken. So why do I think this matters? Well, here's the thought, and here's the actual outcome. So if the world states are equally probable and they pay off just the same, then the functional content of the vector is going to be something like equal. It's going to be 0.5 and 0.5 over both of those. So the message is going to be sort of just a disjunction of the two world states, right? But if state one occurs more often or pays off more strongly than state two, then we might see the vector actually get skewed in a different way. So the content now might be 0.6 world state one and 0.4 state two as the content of this message. Well, this just is a way of representing partial content. So the signal doesn't have to indicate a world state or not. It can indicate a world state to the greater or lesser extent, which is at least partly what we're thinking of aiming for. So in these mixed scenarios, one of these states has done more to stabilize the system than the other, and so it's going to contribute more to the functional content of the signal. So there are degrees of content. Now, there's a very, very important caveat here, which means that we're not there yet, okay? Because what this article actually does, what the model actually does, is it gives us a way to apportion the content of something that's established already as a signal. And that's not the same as having something saying that something is partially a signal. Those are not the same things. And they're part of a full signal. That's different to having a partial signal. Okay, so, and in fact, this model is set up in a way that it can't accommodate that kind of idea. And so, again, talking to Nick, it might be that we can release some of the constraints and actually start getting closer to that. But nevertheless, it does establish that there's a coherent sense in which we might think of signals indicating the state of the world to a partial degree. So it seems like a good start. I think I have about 3 minutes. Two minutes? You didn't? I'm allowed 3. Okay, well, we'll see. I'll see if I can, how much of this I can do. Finally, I remember I was really worried for the graded account that we would be flooded with lots and lots of partial functions all over the place. Yeah, that was a big problem. Just as we saw in Kingsbury's account. Suddenly hemoglobin has a function of making blood to some extent. I think that problem has, I say this concern's been overstated by me in a very big way, and we'll see if I can communicate why. So firstly, natural selection doesn't just mean positive outcome caused by some trait. That's not natural selection. Drift also has positive outcomes caused by traits too, often. And here's another reason why we might think that this is the case. Natural selection requires variation in the population in order to count as natural selection. And I've been talking about hemoglobin all the way through, but I've been tricky because actually there isn't going to be any natural selection on the redness of blood caused by hemoglobin because there's no variation. There's no variation to be selected between here. So there's no natural selection ever going to be able to say that hemoglobin is being selected for generating redness in blood unless something very radical happens to human beings. So in these cases, for example, when I talk about my ancestor getting to the surgeon on time because their blood was coming through the the shirt, that was just a happy accident, and it doesn't count as selection for red blood. Very quick. I also think that we can go further. I think that even if we're talking about cases, sometimes people talk about your heart noises saving your life because someone heard them and realized that you weren't dead yet and so operated on you, or something like that. Even cases like that where we might think that there might be some variation in the population about how loud your heart noises are. These aren't, I don't know if we can call these one-off capricious events natural selection. Natural selection is about something else than just happy outcomes. Okay, it's about something systematic or populational, some shift in the population trait values over time in a systematic way. That is what gets to count as natural selection. So these stories that I've been telling you about tiny little bits of selection somewhere in the past, I actually don't think that we will need to worry about those nearly as much as I've made out before. Coming up with how we differentiate those is an entirely different matter, though. I think that these minimal cases can probably be quite contained. I don't think, even if there are lots of cases of partial functioning out there, they won't be as ubiquitous as I feared. And again, I'm very aware of the time. So note that this is good for Kingsbury too, though. This is not a decisive thing for graded functions. It helps here also. Okay, very quick summary. So I was originally coy about advocating for graded proper functions. I was worried about these issues. How useful would it be? Have I seen the best version of the alternative view? What would it do to teleosemantics? And there would be too many partial functions. But I've just shown you some cases where, firstly, here is a use for partial functions. There's a new concern that's been dealt with. Here is a serious account of the other version that I think fails because it brings in values. There's an extant account of partial content already out there, and there are ways to circumscribe the number of partial functions out there. So I think it's probably time to start being less coy and pursue this more actively. Thank you for these people for their intellectual input, and again, thanks to the organisers of the workshop.
Good. Let me just say thank you for that first. That it worked.
Hold it good.
Now. It's not on.
It will work. Yeah.
Yeah, the big red on button makes sense. Hi, now? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks a lot, John. That was great. So I have one more. Okay. Without having read your paper before, but I came up with a further idea of how functions could be gradual, and I just want to know what you think about this. So Sober's classic distinction between selection of and selection for says roughly that selection for is that the trait is selected for doing something if doing this is causing positive selection, roughly, right? So, and now I encountered that recently many people think of causation as gradual. So if causation is also gradual, then this might also have implications for, yeah, selection for and thereby for functions. Did you ever think about this? Does this boil down to one of the other ways?
Yeah, I think it's probably, I'm not sure if there's a distinct category, there may be, but I think it also distributes over some of those other ways in terms of they affect the causal attribution that we might put to selective force or something like that. Some of the other work that's come out of Paul's lab, Josh Christie started making models that were trying to quantify the effect that selection was having against a background of other features. It turns out, at least as I understand it, the model's so far beyond me, but it's very hard to be confident that if we try to do that kind of causal attribution, that we're going to get something suitably objective where we don't have to make quite a lot of background decisions that could go either way. So it's a bit of a concern actually about how well we could really get a handle on that. I do want to just say one other quick thing though, because I think the point that causation comes in degrees, I do make a point at the end of that paper, which is if you have a different favorite view of function and you're thinking, ha ha ha, selector effect function's in real trouble now that it comes in degrees. Well, if you think causation's got something to do with function, I've got news for you. That also comes in degrees. So, and so does contribution to a goal, and like all of these things come in degrees. So that's just, I think it's going to be unavoidable. But yes, I'm not sure if it's a set category. It might be that it turns out in these other. That's not meant to be an exhaustive list, by the way. Those three are just the three that I sort of came up with. You know, I'm sure there are lots of other ways. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. This is, I think, more of a clarificatory question, just on why it is a problem to have a cornucopia of functions.
Yeah, great.
Specifically, let's say, so you said hemoglobin being red hasn't been selected for because there's no variation in the color of hemoglobin amongst the human population, but there is a variation in the color of, you know, oxygen carrying molecules across life. So perhaps at some point, you know, our blood isn't blue.
Yep.
So what?
Great. So that's a great point. So when I say at the end that I think we can wash out a lot of these cases, I think historical selection will still remain a very big problem. We say any selection whatsoever. There have been periods in the past where our appendix had a great deal of selection on it, and it's not a funny trick where it happened once in the past or something, and we would have to say yes, it is still a function of the appendix. If we say any amount of function whatsoever is enough, and same perhaps for the whatever metal gets to be incorporated into our hemoglobin. The reason I care about there being a cornucopia of them is to do with what we want selected effect function to do for us. So as was pointed out in the first talk by Harriet, one of the reason that I like the idea that we have dysfunction as part of our definition of pathology is that we're going to quite tightly circumscribe what gets to count as pathology. We think of it, for example, as a necessary condition. So I say, why can't sluggish schizophrenia count as a disorder? Because there's no dysfunction here, okay? And it will never be. I can say that's real force. Now that as a restriction becomes toothless very fast if the thing that you're restricting to becomes ubiquitous. And similarly for content, I mean, if we think that we could have selection of signals in some incredibly minor way, we're going to find out that the world's absolutely saturated in partial content everywhere, which seems like now TDS semantics is probably not going to be able to do the job that we as philosophers want to do. Yeah, can we speed up because we don't want to be
Okay, I'll keep it quick. Really, basically, I think this is a direct follow-up to the answer you just gave. Whether, insofar as we admit partial functions, if you grant that this is going to allow for attributions of functions in a more widespread way than on the binary option, one corollary of that seems like, well, it seems we should also predict that there's going to be a wider range of attributions of dysfunctions.
Yes.
And so this
is going to be saturated in dysfunction.
Yeah, and so one might think this is problematic if dysfunctions become a target for intervention, that we might be needing to intervene on more things than we think is appropriate.
That's right. So just ignoring for a bit the last few slides I had, and we're still playing the game where you can find selection very easily. It seems that, so think of some totally repugnant declaration of what a disease is, where people have just decided that one completely legitimate way of being a human being is now going to count as pathology. you can probably figure out some way that there was some tiny amount of selection on that thing sometime in the past, and suddenly this restriction is gone. So that's actually a better way to answer the question that was just asked. If there's dysfunction everywhere, then there's pathology everywhere, and now we can say that anything can fall under the right purview of medicine, and that's not what we want, at least from my perspective. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
So I wanted to go to the partial functions account and see which kind of contribution it is that gives you the partialness, the gradedness. So take the redheads and the blackheads. So the redheads are aggressive. To a certain extent, being aggressive accounts for the presence of that trait in the population because they have a disposition to challenge incumbents. And if they challenge an incumbent that's a passive one, then let's say they have twice as many offspring. So it's very good for fitness. So you might say that gradedness goes with the fitness doubling in that circumstance. On the other hand, there's a big downside because, as you say, sometimes they can encounter a redhead, and let's say, some of the time when that happens, they completely lose all their fitness. They don't have any offspring. And so you might say, well, no, actually the degree goes with the balance of the plus side against the downside. But then the trouble is, at equilibrium, the balance is zero.
Right. So that's right. Oh, well, hold on. If we take a snapshot, it is. But remember, we're going to have to be looking historically also. So, I mean, I suppose the thing that will look very weird is exactly where we end up once we reach equilibrium, taking into account the sort of pluses and minuses of the trait over time to lead to that equilibrium state is going to make whether we think this counts as a function or not, or what degree we give to it, incredibly dependent on what the initial conditions are, because it's going to be a story of the path that we use to get there. So yes, there's going to be no selection at the point of equilibrium. That's not going to necessarily dictate what we say about the functions right now. If we were to take a modern history type view, that's going to mean that slowly that's going to cease to have a function, which would be a very, very strange kind of a result. I have to say, looking at the debate that you have been involved in with the Griffiths lab, I don't think I want to have a position on this story about the explanatory role. I'm very happy for people to find that out, but and then say, do you realize that you could just characterize this in terms of the partial function, and whatever way you have decided is the correct way to think about this. So, yeah.
It's not so obvious for me. It's obvious. You thought it was obviously wrong. Sorry, I would. The view was that it was crazy to say that the aggressiveness and the doublishness had no function. It wasn't so obvious to me that it was crazy.
Oh, right. If I was implying craziness, I think I was being too strong. How about counterintuitive or something like that?
When you were telling the story about rigid black and things, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to say about functions.
Right. I mean, maybe that turns out to be fine. I mean, if I was looking at that population and I saw that the redheads were pushing the blackheads out of nesting spaces and getting more mating opportunities because of that, I would be disinclined to say that there's no function.
Yeah, that's fine. But if as much they're running into other redheads and getting stuff done. Now the redheadedness doesn't obviously have a function. It's neutral.
Right. So I think that's actually the sort of essence of the debate that Paul's having with the other theorists. Is that I think the other theorists would deny that last claim, but I think Justin said.
So we got one more question. There.
So this goes back to
just before the end where you were saying that, for instance, there's no variation between red blood and other colors of blood in human beings or mammals or whatever. So we can screen off some of these apparent difficulties or some of the plethora. And I was wondering if there's enough screen off that the other view can also take advantage of for the same reasons that would make it easier for them to say, for Kingsbury to say, well, the stuff about negligible versus, you know, what's interesting to us doesn't really apply anymore. And so the objective bits can come back in.
Right, so I completely agree. I skipped over this. So here I say, I think exactly what you just said. So I think that, I mean, I'll have to talk to Justine about this, but I think that we could perhaps reinterpret part of what she's saying here as not being, I mean, perhaps negligible means something more like this. So rather than saying, yes, there's lots of instances of these traits having positive effects, we could say something like, well, we can be more demanding about what counts as real natural selection, and then we're going to get this threshold where we could say, once you cross that threshold, actually, it's starting to look like perhaps it's okay to say that gets to count as a function. I mean, I think so. So yes, I think that this is good for both positions, which feels good. It feels like progress. I mean, I think there are other reasons to go the partial route, but I think this is a neutral finding that's good for all of us in terms of the kind of research program of selected effects functions. Yeah.
Do any of those reasons bring back the worry about a lack of objectivity or interest relativeness?
Not that I'm aware of. I didn't have that worry when I'm thinking about it, but I have to confess I'm a bit hesitant to say absolutely not. But the idea would be something like, once you cross that threshold, I think there's still more to be said about there being a hierarchy of to what extent something should be considered a function. I think that there are cases that we would want split apart that would otherwise be lumped together, I think, in general. And I think that just there's a reason for us to go the graded way rather than the binary way. Yeah. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.